In addition to the spoiler warning, I should note that some people might find the content of this video distressing. Ethan Mars is one of the main characters in the game Heavy Rain. He clearly displays some mental health issues during the game, and even sees a therapist. Now this game, more than most, has prompted people to speculate about what disorders Ethan might have. So let's get to the bottom of this complex situation. I'll do that by looking at my own diagnostic impressions as well as those proposed by other people. There's going to be a series of videos discussing this, so let me provide some background information. Ethan starts the game as a happily married father of 2 children. One day, he's shopping at the mall with his family and he loses track of his 10-year-old son Jason in the crowds. He finally finds Jason, but just before he's wandering into the street. Ethan dives to try to save his son, but he's too late and Jason is killed by an oncoming car. We next see Ethan 2 years later. He's been in a coma for 6 months. He avoids crowded and public places because he's scared he will have a panic attack, and he even has times when he blacks out and has no memory of what happened during the blackouts. One day, he's at the park with his remaining son Sean, and he has one of these blackouts. When he comes to, his son Sean is missing. Ethan goes to the police to try to find his son, and they tell him that they think Sean may have been kidnapped by someone known as the Origami Killer. This is a serial killer who kidnaps children and drowns them in rainwater. Ethan privately receives messages from the Origami Killer, wherein he's given a series of trials where he's supposed to prove his love for his son. Ethan also wonders if maybe somehow he is the Origami Killer and he's testing his love for his son during his blackouts. One of my initial thoughts when approaching this case was that Ethan might have something called depersonalization disorder. This is when people have episodes where they feel detached from themselves and like they're merely an observer of their life rather than the person in control. Perhaps they feel like they're in a dream or are an automaton. Now, many people actually have brief episodes of depersonalization, but this disorder is characterized by causing significant distress to that person in their life. Now, this certainly seems to be the case with Ethan. Part of depersonalization disorder is that while the person is in that state, they are still able to test reality. In other words, they understand that something odd is happening to them. They don't actually believe they're in a dream, for example. Now, this does not seem to be the case with Ethan. When he has one of his blackouts, he is completely unaware of what's going on. This is an important aspect of depersonalization disorder and leads me to believe that Ethan does not fit for this diagnosis. However, these types of experiences are more common in people that have experienced trauma, so that's what we'll be looking at next time. Ethan Mars has obviously been through a traumatic experience, but does he have post-traumatic stress disorder? And if he does this explain his blackouts? As noted in an earlier video, diagnosing PTSD is actually pretty complex because it can be manifested in such a wide variety of ways. Now, I won't go into too much detail in this video. You can watch one of my earlier videos for that, but let's look at the criteria that might apply to Ethan. Well, part of PTSD is experiencing a trauma. In Ethan's case, this was when he witnessed the death of his son. His reaction to this was intense fear and helplessness. Following the trauma, Ethan has a lot of difficulty sleeping and concentrating. He's unable to complete routine tasks, such as looking after his son Sean. After the trauma, Ethan avoids things associated with it, such as crowded public areas. He even has symptoms of a panic attack when he's in crowded public areas. Following the trauma, Ethan seems much more estranged from other people, such as his son Sean, with whom he used to have a pretty close relationship. He also seems to have a flattened affect, that is, he doesn't seem to show too much emotion. Activities that were once pleasurable to him, such as spending time with his sons, no longer seem interesting to him. These symptoms have had a significant impact on his life, which is shown by him no longer being happily married and no longer working as an architect. He's also had these symptoms for well over 1 month. Considering all of this information, I definitely think Ethan has post-traumatic stress disorder, but does this explain his blackouts? Actually, I think it might. Watch our next video to find out why. Interestingly, PTSD might be the best explanation for Ethan's blackouts. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the American book with all of the mental health issues, says regarding PTSD that in rare instances, the person experiences dissociative states that last from a few seconds to several hours or even days, during which components of the event are relived, and the person behaves as though experiencing the event at that moment. This might be what's going on during Ethan's blackouts. It's been said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life. What I'm about to explain might be kind of a complex notion, but the short version is that sometimes when people experience a trauma, the unconscious part of their mind will try to make sense out of what happened to them so they can move on with their life. This is sometimes done through reenacting or re-experiencing the event. That quote that I just read is basically saying that in rare cases, this reenacting or re-experiencing is so distressing to the conscious mind that it checks out, and the mind tries to handle things on an unconscious level. In Ethan's case, during a blackout, this checking out of the mind is called dissociation. The stress of having his son killed and then hearing on the news that someone is kidnapping and killing small children might be so emotionally overwhelming for Ethan's conscious mind that he dissociates in order to process what's going on. This would explain why he had an origami figure in his hand when he came out of one of his blackouts. He was trying to process through everything he was hearing and experiencing. This whole situation is, of course, significantly compounded when his son Sean is kidnapped. Additionally, Ethan does genuinely wonder if he is a serial killer and is killing small children. Such a thought would likely be so emotionally overwhelming that he would dissociate in order to process through it. PTSD might also be the best explanation for Ethan's panic symptoms. One symptom of PTSD is that a person might have a physical reaction to things that remind them of the trauma. In Ethan's case, when he goes into crowds, he has a shortness of breath and a rapid heartbeat and sweaty hands and fear. Those are things that look just like a acute panic attack. We'll talk more about this next time. The main part of panic disorder is the presence of recurrent, unexpected panic attacks and fear of having more panic attacks. Is this what's going on with Ethan Mars? First, let's look at panic attacks themselves. They are characterized by the sudden, rapid onset of a pounding heart, shaking, sweating, intense fear, symptoms like that. Panic attacks are actually symptoms of a lot of different disorders and are not a disorder in and of themselves. Often, people who have had panic attacks get so nervous about having another one that they avoid places where it would be difficult to leave if they were to have a panic attack. This is called agoraphobia. People could have panic disorder with or without agoraphobia. Note that agoraphobia does not mean that a person simply has a fear of public places, which is what's often mistakenly believed. Ethan has had panic attacks, but they are not unexpected. That is, they seem to occur around crowds and not completely at random. They seem much more connected with a prior traumatic experience involving crowds. So his panic attacks seem much more associated with PTSD than with the unpredictable ones, such as in panic disorder. As noted in the DSM, if the panic attacks occur only in situations that can be associated with the traumatic event, then the panic attacks should be attributed to post-traumatic stress disorder. Due to the connection with Ethan's previous trauma, PTSD seems to be the best explanation for his panic attacks. Incidentally, Ethan also meets criteria for major depressive disorder. However, I think that PTSD does a much better job of explaining why he's depressed, but it would be appropriate to diagnose him with both. While some people have theorized that Ethan has some other disorders, specifically schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder, we'll look at schizophrenia next time. Ethan Mars displays some symptoms that appear very unusual to the general public. For example, he has blackouts where he is apparently still doing things. He also has impossible experiences, such as the time he went to the train station and everyone froze in place. Does he have schizophrenia? I should start by noting that, in my opinion, the general public seems to really misunderstand schizophrenia. I've mostly heard it described as something where people believe they have multiple people living inside of them or that they have multiple personalities. This is actually a lot more closely related to dissociative identity disorder, which we'll talk about next time. Schizophrenia is much different than that. Allow me to explain. Schizophrenia is one of those disorders that is pretty complex, and it would take way too long for me to explain all the caveats of it in just this video. However, I'll do my best to provide a fairly brief and accurate explanation. To be diagnosed with schizophrenia, a person would need to have at least 2 of 5 possible criteria. Those 5 criteria are delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms. Let me explain what those mean since they are mostly in therapist lingo. A delusion is defined as a false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what almost everyone else believes and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. In other words, it's believing something that isn't true even though the person has proof that that thing isn't true. It's also not really consistent with what's common in that person's culture. For example, a person might believe in God and pray to God, and even be given proof that God doesn't exist. However, this wouldn't be considered a delusion in the United States because lots of people in the United States believe in God. Sometimes it's pretty hard to tell the difference between a delusion and a very firmly held belief, and professional judgment is often necessary. An example of a delusion might be believing that you own a piece of property even though you've been shown the deed to that property and you're not the one who owns it. Another example of a delusion might be believing that your neighbor is a cyborg and is trying to kill you. A hallucination is defined this way: a sensory perception that has the compelling sense of reality of a true perception, but that occurs without external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ. In other words, a person's brain believes that they're sensing something even though their organs, like their eyes or their ears, aren't actually picking up anything. Hallucinations involve the senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. The most common hallucinations are hearing voices, and the second most common is seeing things. Since the person's mind believes that they're sensing something even though their organs aren't, to that person, the hallucination is very real, even though no one else is able to sense what's going on. An example of a hallucination might be hearing harassing voices. Another example might be seeing a bright light everywhere. Disorganized speech is kind of hard to explain. It's like when a person suddenly and constantly changes the subject, but it happens in an odd way. They will sometimes change the subject mid-sentence or even mid-word. Sometimes they'll string words together that are completely unrelated to each other, and that person's basically incomprehensible. That's what's known as word salad. An example of disorganized speech might be something like, I want star and bar, treetop, fire, gang, Washington, D.C., keep it up. Disorganized or catatonic behavior can take a variety of forms, but it basically boils down to behavior that doesn't seem to serve any purpose. Perhaps it could be engaging in repetitive movements, or saying something over and over again, or refusing to move for no apparent reason. An example of this could be someone who rubs their hands together all day, every day. Another example could be someone who just sits still and stares at nothing for hours at a time. Negative symptoms might not be what you'd expect, so allow me to explain. Typically, a person wakes up, goes to the bathroom, eats food, interacts with people, and they go about their daily business. Delusions and hallucinations are examples of something being added to this typical existence, and they are known as positive symptoms. Negative symptoms are when something is taken away from what is typical. Perhaps the person doesn't have an appetite. Perhaps they have no desire to interact with other people at all. Perhaps their overall thinking is less and they can't focus. Things like that. Other examples of negative symptoms might be a complete lack of motivation. Another example might be someone who expresses or feels little or no emotion. Well, that's an explanation of the 5 main parts of schizophrenia, and a person would need to have at least 2 of them to be considered for the diagnosis. A person only needs 1 if their delusion is bizarre. That means that there is absolutely no way that their belief is based in reality. There are actually other aspects of diagnosing schizophrenia, but I don't know that we really need to look at them because Ethan doesn't seem to meet any of those 5 criteria at all. The only one he even comes close with is the negative symptoms, where he's really depressed and has no motivation. But I think that has a lot more to do with PTSD-related depression than it does with schizophrenia. Well, this has been a much longer video than usual. Stay tuned for our final episode on Ethan, where we will talk about whether or not he has multiple personality disorder. Due to Ethan's blackouts and possibly acting out during them, some people have said that he has multiple personality disorder. Could this be the case? I should start by noting that multiple personality disorder is not a diagnosis anymore. It hasn't been for quite some time. It's now called dissociative identity disorder. This is a pretty unique and very rare diagnosis that some mental health professionals believe isn't even real. I do believe it's real. As we discussed in an earlier video, dissociating refers to when a person's brain checks out because the conscious mind cannot deal with something that's too emotionally overwhelming. The technical definition of dissociating is a disruption in the usually integrated functions of consciousness, memory, identity, or perception. So in other words, these four aspects of ourselves usually all work together, but dissociating means that one or more of them isn't in sync. For example, if someone was enduring a prolonged trauma such as severe physical abuse over many years, consciously confronting the situation might be too emotionally overwhelming. In order to deal with this, the mind might dissociate in order to deal with things on an unconscious level. Specifically, the mind may fracture into multiple pieces. This is so that the main identity can still function in other important areas of life. A criteria of dissociative identity disorder is the presence of at least two distinct personality states that each have their own way of being and thinking. When one identity is present and manifest, the other ones aren't. Another criteria is the inability to recall important personal information that's way too extensive to be explained by regular forgetfulness. The extra identities tend to be exaggerated parts of a person. For example, a person's main identity might be timid and reserved, while another identity state is very aggressive and protective. One identity state might be super compassionate, while another identity state overly intellectualizes everything. The theory is that each of these identities are part of the whole self, but to integrate them would be way too emotionally overwhelming. So rather than thinking of a person having multiple personalities, think of a person with a single fragmented identity. Each identity is simply part of the whole self. What is typical is that a person has one main identity, and when they shift into another identity state, they have no memory of what happened. Perhaps they find clothing in their house that they apparently bought, but they have no memory of buying it because they did so while they were in another identity state. This is the part of dissociative identity disorder that seems relevant to Ethan. He has times when he doesn't remember what he's done, but he has apparently done something. This is most apparent the time he came out of a blackout and had an origami figure in his hand. It's possible that Ethan had assumed another identity during this blackout and had been up and about doing things, and that he doesn't remember things because he was in another identity state. However, it's very difficult to determine if this is what's going on because we have absolutely no collateral information from anyone else. There's virtually no evidence that he's assuming other identity states during his blackouts. It's notable that Ethan does not meet one of the main criteria of dissociative identity disorder. That is, that he does remember important personal information. That is, he knows his name's Ethan Mars, that one of his sons was killed, that he's divorced, etc. Well, after all of this talk about Ethan Mars, it seems his one and only diagnosis is post-traumatic stress disorder. Hopefully you play the game in such a way that he gets some help with that. The next character we discuss won't be quite so serious. We're going to talk about someone I don't believe anyone else has attempted to diagnose. The line from Tetris. Why doesn't it ever come when you need it?